our research colloques, of our research colloquium series. For this one, we have a guest coming from Boston University. We usually have either 5 college faculty or UMass faculty, but once in a while we have guests that come from a little further away. And Eric Michael Kelly is from the Department of Anthropology at Boston University. And he's coming today to talk to us about shamans. Do you know what a shaman is? Do you know what a shaman is? Who wants to venture? What is a shaman?
I don't know if it holds true for now, but it used to be, at least in my knowledge, it was like a almost like a religious guide that also performed some type of duties of like a doctor as well within like a tribal community.
Okay, that's that's a good definition of what a shaman is, but it's good to set that up from the beginning. So he's going to be talking to us about rethinking primary charisma, Ava-guarani shamanic leadership in Eastern Paraguay. And he wants you to know that this is in support of the chapter, the routinization of improvisation in Ava-guarani shamanic leadership in Eastern Paraguay, in the Contemporary Anthropology of Religion series through Palgrave, the Anthropology of Religious Charisma, Ecstasis and Institutions, edited by Charles Lindholm, a publication that's expected in December 18, 2013.
Well, first I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and thanks the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies for inviting me and having me here, and especially Gloria because she helped facilitate the whole process since last March. I also should thank briefly the people who funded my research. So that includes the Brandeis University Anthropology Department as well as the Latin American Studies program there, and also the Explorers Club and the Fulbright student grant program as well. And then of course I have to thank all of the people that I work so closely with in Paraguay, especially the shamans and their families who welcomed me into their homes and their lives and shared everything pretty much with me. So I want to start off just with a little contextual information to set the scene because I'm not sure how familiar you are with Paraguay or Ava-guarani. So this light green area that also includes this darker green area, this is all part of the Bosque Atlántico del Alto Paraná, or the Alto Paraná Atlantic rainforest. The part in green is in eastern Paraguay, and the rest goes into Argentina and Brazil. Not much is left of it at this point. As you can see, at least at the part in Paraguay, the top left is 1945. The darkened area is how much forest there was at that time. And you can see how it progresses all the way up to 2007. So there really isn't that much of the original forest left. And the places where there is forest left tends to be these little pockets in indigenous communities because they're using the forest in sustainable ways that they've used for a very long time. And the reason the deforestation is so rampant is because of development, both in terms of hydroelectric projects, but also in terms of soy, especially ranching. Paraguay is one of the most, I think they were number 4, but they've risen a bit, so I'm not sure if that number is accurate still, on the number of the soy exporters in the world. And then there's also a lot of ranching that goes on as well. So here you can see over here, this is the border, Ciudad de Este on this side of the river, and then Foz do Iguaçu is the Brazilian side. So this is 1973. You can tell that not much development was going on. By 2003, this whole area has really developed into a major boom town on both sides of the border, and it continues to be lost to this day. This is an image from a few weeks ago from a Paraguayan news. It just shows you the period between August of last year and May of this year, and the amount of hectares that were deforested in this eastern region of this rainforest. This graph down here shows you how it spiked so dramatically up to the 70s, the deforestation did, and then it tapered off a bit. 2004, the government passed a law, Deforestation Zero, essentially in English, to stop deforestation in the eastern part of the country. That made 90% of the deforestation rate decrease, but there's still deforestation going on, when you don't have that much left to begin with, it's an obvious problem. Plus, the numbers aren't so accurate. So this, just to show you, this department right here is Canindeyú department, and that's the next slide. So quite a lot of indigenous people and most of the Ava-guarani people live in this department. Some live a little bit further north. Some also live on the Brazilian side of the border as well. The communities I'm going to be talking about are essentially, right here, Itamarami, and then over here a bit, it's not so easy to see up here, but Ava-guarani. Now, I've worked in these areas for over 20 months and other communities as well, but primarily I was focused in Itamarami and Ava-guarani. So the 2010-12 census for indigenous people in Paraguay found that there are almost 17,700 people of Ava-guarani. That is 99% of them living in rural Paraguay in 110 recognized communities. And what this means is these are communities that the state recognizes as being legitimate, and they may or may not have title to their lands, but the land situation is problematic in the sense that there are constantly people coming in from the outside and claiming to own title to indigenous lands, and these typically in the area where I work are Brazilians who are coming over and they're trying to develop the land for soy production especially. If you're interested in that part, which I can't get into today unfortunately as much, you can read my piece in the, I think it's March 2013 issue of Cultural Survival about my friends in Ava-guarani who last year in November had their community, a judge ruled in favor of a Brazilian landholder, saying that he actually held the title to their land, even though they held it through the Indigenous Institute in Paraguay. And they sent in 400 Paraguayan military police, along with a handful of these Brazilian farmhands. The police were just there to control the people. And you got to keep in mind this is a community with way less than 400 people, and so having 400 heavily armed policemen is a bit overkill to begin with. They just kept the people in control, moved all the kids and the people out of their houses while these farmhands destroyed the community. They burned down everything, destroyed the school, and poisoned the people's wells, and stole their animals, the domesticated animals, and their belongings. And they did get their community back, and they're working on it. But everything I'm going to tell you today, it has to be understood in the backdrop of this extreme situation that these people are in, where rapidly losing the forest, which is their traditional subsistence, but also the source for their religious beliefs and their culture completely. And then this is just continuing to be an ongoing problem for them. They're getting squeezed from all sides really badly. Okay. So the paper today that I'm presenting is about leadership. Traditionally, shamans among the Guarani peoples, especially the Ava-guarani with whom I work, were the leaders of their communities. And so I originally went there to study music and language in relationship to shamanic healing rituals. Now, this quote is from an Ava-guarani shaman that I worked with for many years, and you'll notice it's a mixture of Guarani and Spanish, which is normal for these people to speak a mixture, which we call Jopara. So he's saying essentially, "She en comunicación directo con mi jar," which Nahae por lapis patia aro. And this just means I'm in direct communication with our master. It's not by means of pencil and paper. So what's significant about this is traditional shamans are chosen by the spirits rather than being elected to their office, as in the case of bureaucratic leaders. The people that I work with distinguished the leaders. They call their shamans their natural leaders, and they call the people who occupy the bureaucratic offices that are elected, like cacique, comisario, etc., they call those folks common leaders. And that started to be an issue right away for me when I returned in 2005 to pick up on my fieldwork that I started in 2001, because the chief of the community was upset that I went to stay with this young shaman on the other side of the community, and he was constantly trying to make me come and stay with him and control me. And so I was avoiding him. He wasn't a shaman. I was interested in studying shamanism. And in the process, I was told, in the middle of this ritual, this guy got up and interrupted all the shamans and basically said, Eric has to leave. He hasn't learned anything. He's not learning any Guarani. But the shamans dismissed him and said, no, he's not. So there was this tension right away for the beginning of my long-term field work of this cacique trying to kick me out of the community all the time, and these other people saying, no, don't worry about him. He's just a common leader. You don't have to worry about him. He's not the one that has the true authority here. He can't make you leave unless people in general want you to leave. So let me see if I'm getting ahead of myself a bit here before I get to the jazz part. Sorry about this, guys. I'm not going to try to read the paper. If you want to read the paper, it will be out in a few months. But basically, the focus of this here is this tension between these leaders in this particular community of Tanomami, these common leaders, and then these young shamans who are rising up and trying to assert their authority in the wake of the death of this great shaman who had died just a few months before I came back. So this young shaman that I live with, one of my primary consultants, his name is Pedro. I'll be talking quite a bit about him. I stayed with him on the other side of the community, and essentially what Pedro was trying to do, because he was unsatisfied, along with a lot of other people in the community, with the corruption associated with common leaders, was to transpose natural leadership of the forest onto the common leadership and try to work on behalf of his community towards the state, because they were getting unsatisfactory results. But before I continue, I'll come back to the story of the tensions. I just want to set up sort of the theoretical framework here. So shamanism is the prototypical category of Weber, Max Weber, in case you're not familiar with him. It's ideal type of primary charisma. So he argues that there's primary charisma, which is inherent in what he also calls a natural leader, but he means something slightly different by it. Obviously, he wasn't working with the Ava-guarani. But basically, he was basing this idea on classical cases of Siberian shamanism, especially. And that said, there's been a lot of studies on shamanism cross-culturally since Weber's time, and generally speaking, scholars today recognize that there's a lot of variations in shamanic practices, both within the so-called classic cases, but also within and across societies. So we really need to try to keep that in mind, because there are some few holdouts that say we only should talk about shamans in relationship to the Siberian classical cases, and then there's other people, which is the majority now, that say no. There's always been variation. There's variation within those cases. There's variation still. Now, the thing about Weber's category of the primary primary charismatic leader, is he juxtaposes that against the opposite end of the spectrum, which would be increased rationalized bureaucracy. And so in that kind, you have somebody whose power inheres in the office rather than in the individual. Now, the thing about this that I'm trying to add to Weber is improvisation isn't necessarily implicit in his category, because you can't be inspired and not be improvising at some level. But at the same time, he went maybe a bit too far in thinking about this as being something that just erupts out of nowhere, and then how's the shaman going to communicate with people to be followers? Necessarily, the shaman, even though he or she's going to be improvising, is going to be doing so within the context of a particular language, a particular set of symbolic systems, and they can't just suddenly develop something completely new from scratch, because if they did, no one would understand what they were doing. They wouldn't even be able to communicate. So shamanism is inherently improvisational, but there's also a need to try to stay within a particular range, or it wouldn't make sense to the people. So I argue in this paper that a comparison with jazz performances helps us make sense out of this kind of thing. According to Weber, shamans have to continually, or other primary charismatics, prove that they actually have this charisma. For Ava-guarani shamans, and probably other shamans elsewhere, one of the ways that they do this is through their performances. So they're charismatically inspired performances that they lead other people in. Now, in jazz improvisation, the way it works with small groups is you typically have a structure called the head of a tune, which is going to include the chord progressions, the melody, and probably originally at least a basic rhythm, swing, rumba, etc. But the thing about it is, you start out with this relatively fixed head, probably a fixed tempo, but then people can improvise all over that frame however they choose to. So some people down the road could take it, and if the style was originally a swing, they could change it and play it with a heavy metal kind of feel, or the rhythm section, which would include the piano, bass, and drums, might play double time, or the solo stay in the regular time. But what's going on always here is a kind of collaborative improvisation. So soloists take turns improvising over the head. Usually this head's stated up front, but could be otherwise as well. And then they'll improvise over the head, the chord progressions, but they're not just sort of out there by themselves. All the other people are interacting with them. So they're listening to them, they're making eye contact, and they're interacting. So this is a supportive improvisation, collaboratively speaking. Now, shamans are also called in the literature mediators par excellence, both between their visible and invisible communities, so the invisible community of spirits that they're participating in, but also between various kinds of physical actors in the actual world. Could be within their community, but it could also be between their community and outsiders. And in their mediation, shamans select elements from their available cultural stocks of knowledge while they improvise from there, kind of like a jazz performer does. So they're constructing these improvisations in collaboration with their clients that they're working to heal typically, but also with the people who join in supportively musically and dancing with their performances. So basically what I'm arguing here is that what we really need to focus on here is not what Weber called the routinization of charisma, but instead, in primary charismatics at least, we need to focus on the routinization of improvisation itself, because that's what's going on here. There's a tradition of improvising within a particular frame, and of course over time that frame will necessarily change as cultures everywhere change over time. So as both Weber and Ricardo Santa Cruz independently observe, the power of this primary charismatic leader resides in the person rather than in the office like the bureaucrats. Now, this is only going to be true if the community continues to recognize the proofs that are put forward by the shaman, and in this case, the performances themselves are the proofs, as we'll see. I also argue that this approach is worth pursuing not just for Ava-guarani shamans or South American shamans, but also in terms of conceptualizing shamanisms cross-culturally. So before I move on any further, I want to situate the Ava-guarani shamanic leadership case, I should have shown you the slide already, within its traditional cosmology and ritual. So the Tupi-Guarani peoples occupied the entire Atlantic seaboard of Brazil for the most part, down into the foothills of the Andes and into Paraguay. And so at this time, these were Tupi-Guarani people speaking languages that are related to this language family of Tupi-Guarani. And all of these people have in common the fact that they're trying to find the land without evil, ultimately. The land without evil is similar to the Christian concept of heaven, with one major difference being that it's believed that you can actually get there during your lifetime on the earth. So traditionally, these prophets or shamans would have these visions about where the land without evil was located, and they would take followers off in search of it, thinking that they were going to get there and have a better life. And whether they did or not was, of course, variable, but that was the point, that people would follow them off this way, and so groups would fish in this process. Now, also the Ava-guarani, along with other folks, have been characterized as being extremely acculturated, and this is used, unfortunately, against them a lot of the time. So, for example, when the Rainforest Reserve was built, the Ava-guarani were excluded from having access to it because they were deemed as being too acculturated, not Indian enough. But at the same time, they get discriminated against for being Indian, so they can't really win either way that they go. What this means is they're prohibited from hunting and gathering stuff from the forest that they would traditionally use, even though, as they point out to me, we're not the ones who invented bulldozers and chainsaws and all these kinds of things. Now, up until pretty recently, leadership in Amazonia in general was considered to be generally oblique, whether it was charismatic or bureaucratic in nature. In other words, leaders relied traditionally on persuasion rather than force. So it's in the scholarly literature, it's seen that they had a rather weak form of literature. They weren't able to force anybody to do anything. But this is a bit of oversimplification of leadership, as we've seen with more research going on in South America. And essentially, there's variation in leadership styles across the spectrum. So at pre-conquest, before the Spaniards and Portuguese and other Europeans arrived in the area, there were all sorts of different societies that were around that we know about through archaeological and ethno-historical research now. Whereas before, people used to think that all the Indians that they saw were simply the same representations of what was on forever. Since time immemorial, they were all hunters and gatherers. They had these really small communities. but that was not taking into consideration the fact that European diseases, which the indigenous people had no resistance to, preceded them. They moved faster than they did. So a lot of the times when there would have been bigger civilizations previously, they may have already been wiped out. At the same time, a lot of times groups would move and run off into the forest to get away, so a society that may have been more complicated previously and not simply been a hunting and gathering society may have appeared to be one by the time that the outsiders arrived. Okay. So, people that I work with, like other Tupi-Guarani peoples, call themselves Ka-Wuvwa, which means people of the forest. And this is what their whole traditional culture, religion, and subsistence and everything is based on. So at the center you've got the forest itself, then you've got all the inhabitants of the forest, the animals, the plants, the river, but you also have the visible sky and stars, including the sun. Now, as in Tupi-Guarani and other Amazonian societies, the sun and the moon are considered to be cultural heroes who are twins, and for the Guarani, at least, I think you have this, yes, Quarahu is the name of the sun. He was the first shaman, and his movements in the sky, which you can see every day, provide the template for all shamans who have come since. So you see him daily as he leads the inhabitants of the invisible spirit world in a dance across the sky. Jeroku is the Guarani word for dance, and it's the word that they use to describe these performances led by shamans. It includes singing and dance, but generally speaking, they don't separate those out. They use one word for both for this particular kind of performance. So they believe that during the day, the sun's dancing and leading the invisible mirror spirit world up in the sky, all the way up until it gets to the zenith at noon, and then they'll say, Quarahu is up there, and everybody's dancing just like we are right now. So as you can see, the men form a gendered line where they start parallel to each other, basically roughly shoulder to shoulder. This guy is an old shaman who's leading the performance. The women stand a few feet back behind in their own parallel line, and the instruments that these guys play are gendered. So the males play rattles, which you'll see some better pictures of. You can see one taken out here. And women play these bamboo stomping tubes that they pound on the ground. And the shaman is going to lead all of these folks in the dance and in the singing by using his rattle, by gesturing, and by also moving between the lines of gendered performers, which signifies his ability as a mediator between peoples, because again, like I said previously, shamans are mediators par excellence. So these guys are doing exactly what Quarahu is doing from their perspective. In the southern hemisphere, the sun appears to be going counterclockwise, and they dance counterclockwise as well, and they always face east where the sun rises, and then the dance goes around in this same way. Jeroku is both serious and it's simultaneously casual in the sense that it's very much going on in the context of daily life, and people can come and go, and unlike most of the kinds of religious activities that we're familiar with, at least in terms of the big world religions or so-called world religions, there's not a big distinction between the performers and the leaders in this, in the sense that they all sit in similar places, they can come and go during the performance, people sleep, they drink tea, but there's generally this idea that they're going to respect the performance being led by the shaman. Now, at the end, after everybody who has some kind of illness is presented to the shaman, and there may be multiple shamans performing at any given time, this is a picture of Pedro healing a young man in Ava-guarani, and you can see that the performance continues to go on around them. After all of this sort of, this is a very clumsy way to say it, but just the sacred elements of the ritual, there's this corn beverage, which in Spanish is commonly called chicha throughout the Americas. That's mildly fermented, made by women. In Guarani, it's kanwija. And so they make this goes in this structure that looks like a canoe, the Urania A. It sits out and ferments for a few days, and then after the quote-unquote sacred parts of the ritual, you have the shaman who sings over this beverage, the women who made it bring it to him for this, and then it's going to be shared with all the community members while they dance in round dances, which are a lot more secular, which is again a bad way to put it, but just in a hurry, it's a useful kind of shorthand. And basically during this time, women and men hold hands together. Anybody can lead the dance or the song. The songs actually have lyrics to them, whereas the shaman songs typically are in esoteric language that either nobody understands or there's just a few words here and there people understand. So there's elements of secrecy and authority in that sense too with them. But this part instead is a time for great flirtation, laughter. People intentionally, anybody can suddenly leave their circle off in a strange direction. The steps is an odd time, so people screw up regularly. And then when they do that, it makes everybody laugh. It's really a lot of fun actually during this part. So women can lead the performances, men can lead them, and also children can too. I should also say that, again, this stuff is complicated and I can't possibly talk about everything at once. Women can be shamans too, and they can become powerful shamans. Usually this happens when they're postmenopausal. But during the Jeroku itself, shamans will take turns leading the performers in the songs that they receive directly from Yandi Jara, which is our master. Now, some shamans may take multiple turns on a given night, and again, attendees are going to show their support simply by being there for a particular shaman's performance, but also especially if they get up and join in the dance and music making with him. And when they do that, they're basically voting for the shaman, if you will. And so constantly, if they recognize the shaman and the shaman's improvisations by supporting the shaman and participating, then that's going to shore up the shaman's power. Now, it's said that Kwarahu, the sun, again, wears all these same things that the shamans wear. So the akangwa, which is the headdress that you see Pedro wearing here, the jasa'a, which are these bandoliers across his chest, Ho'apu, which you can't see in this picture, but I'll show you another one. It's a bracelet that's made out of cloth similar to this, or sometimes it can be made out of a long strand of human hair that's braided and then wrapped around the wrist multiple times. And that, I would argue, signifies the importance of women here, along with shamanism, because a shaman cannot become powerful without the support of a lot of women. His wife, female kin, other women, because they're going to come and sing with him and dance and make the performance more impressive. And then finally, the mbaraka, which is the rattle that male shamans play, and female shamans can actually play these as well. They can choose to play either the female or male instrument. So this is really elaborately decorated intentionally by Pedro as a young shaman who was trying to assert his authority in the death of his great-grandfather shaman. Alright, so this is all pretty routinized, what I've talked about so far. Stuff that's a frame or a head to make the jazz comparison again. And some shamans might have a few people that join in with them, some might have quite a few. It just depends. That's, again, all about voting. Here's women standing in the women's line. You can see this woman with the rattle and the headdress. She's actually a shaman, and interestingly, the women can lead from either the women's line or they can, well, they always lead from the women's line, but they can play other instrument. And then here's just a picture where you can see Pedro mediating between the two lines. He can dance back and forth. Mitakarai, which is the naming ritual, is very similar to these basic Jeroku kind of performances, in the sense that the structure is the same. The main difference here is that they're way larger, a lot more people attend these, and this is a ritual where individuals have their names, which are also their souls, revealed to the community by these great-grandfather shamans who have the ability to see these soul names in their dreams and in the baptismal water, if you will. This is not baptismal water in a Catholic sense, but it is used in a somewhat similar kind of way. So the other difference about this is it takes a long time to prepare. It takes months. People in the community, men gather beeswax, women gather cactus fiber to make these candles that everybody uses during the performance. And the ritual itself lasts for 5-6 days straight. People come from very far away, non-stop dancing and singing. You just sleep when you get a chance, but it's going on all around you the entire time, no matter what. And when there's a lot of people, there are hammocks everywhere, and you're literally cheek by jowl with everybody all the time. Now, this ritual probably occurred more frequently in the past, along with the births of children, but nowadays, in my experience, it typically occurs about once a year, and it occurs around August, roughly speaking. It's not set to a calendar. So, arguably, what these guys are doing when they dance in the pattern of the sun is performing a diagrammatic icon in semiotic terms, and that just means it's an iconic diagram of what's going on in the supernatural world and here on Earth. And the other thing that's particularly interesting here about what the shamans are doing with their rattles is whenever they play the rattle, they rotate it also counterclockwise so that the pellets inside the rattle move around in a rhythmic rate, and it's just the same as the path of the dance and the sun. And with the rattle, the shaman's going to signal the entry point for the other participants to come into their parts. The men loosely imitate the shaman. They have an aesthetic for a wide unison. They're not trying to play in perfect unison with each other, which I would argue is symbolic of their relative egalitarianism, at least within a particular gender, not so much between them. But the shaman's wife and close female kin are going to be really familiar with his songs, and therefore through performing them all the time, they're going to be able to help the other people know where to come in, where to leave, and all of this suggests, again, that this is highly routinized as far as the performance genre goes. So the positioning of the people is also mirrored by the folks in the spirit world as well. The fact that they're facing east is significant too. But this ritual, Ava-guarani, further locates people in the socio-cosmic hierarchy because the name soul isn't just the name soul, it's actually, they are that thing. The shaman sees it. It positions them in the spirit world, where their soul came from, where it is. And all this is really important because if you need to have healing that requires a shaman, the shaman won't be able to heal you unless you have one of these forest named souls, because that will let him or her know where they have to travel in order to find this lost or sick soul and reseed it in the patient. Now, there are essentially 3 levels of shamanism here, or shaman. At the simplest level, you have people called Ava-guarani, which means one who sings. And this can be anyone, actually. At first, every single person can get songs from God in their dreams, but only someone who starts leading them in these rituals of Jeroku would start to be called an Ava-guarani. If they do this regularly and make it further along, they can become a tamoy, which is grandfather loosely. And then the female term would be jarui, and that's grandmother. So if they really make it far and they've lived a really serene life full of wisdom and promoting good cultural practices, they can become a great-grandfather shaman or a tamoy guasu. And these are the only individuals who are able to locate individuals in the spirit world. Now, they call all of these folks, once they reach the tamoy level, they're going to call everybody in the community my grandchildren, Shere Miyariro, and they'll be addressed back as grandfather or grandmother as appropriate. And this arguably signifies the intergenerational love between grandparents and grandchildren more generally. Now, not very many people can become a tamoy guasu, obviously, so this isn't just a very common thing. There are very few of them, and in fact, there's less nowadays than there were before. So all of what I've been talking about so far suggests this really morphological rigidity, routinized kind of aspects that mimetically enact activities going on in the spirit world. But in this cosmological schema, again, anybody can receive their songs directly, but it's only going to be these people who rise up to the level of tamoy guasu or jarui guasu that can actually give names. Now, you have to get to that point not by simply acting on this sort of morphological pattern. Instead, you have to improvise, which is what I'm arguing here, and you have to do so collaboratively. So here's an image again of Pedro. In this picture, you can see the poapa on his left wrist, which is female hair. It's this really long braid, and as you can imagine, since it's a thin braid, about that thin, it's wrapped around quite a number of times. It's quite a lot of hair. Now, there's lots of opportunities to improvise within this context, this performance genre, just like there are chances to blow over the head to allow jazz musicians to demonstrate their improvisatory chops. But between dance and song sections here with the Ava-guarani rituals, There are also spoken sections that are interspersed, and they can all last for quite a while. And these sections are basically where the shaman's going to be telling of his or her visions and haranguing people to live in the right way and trying to convince them that what they've seen in the spirit world is correct. Now, participants will voice their assent by saying Yako, or which we translate here, in addition to joining in the performances while the shaman's speaking. The vigor of the audience's oral assent is an indicator of the shaman's influence over them. Now, musically speaking, shamans can improvise both by quoting the melodies of senior shamans, much like somebody might quote Charlie Parker if they're playing improvising jazz. And so, for instance, Pedro sometimes would quote this great deceased shaman who died right before I returned, but he also would quote these songs that were sung by Ava-guarani, who was a shaman that lived in the nearby community of Ava-guarani, where I worked and I talked about previously. Now, Pedro actually was able to get Ava-guarani to come to Itamarami to lead this rite, which Pedro wouldn't have been able to hold on himself. He was only able to host it. And so that in itself was part of this process of shoring up his own authority. And during this particular Mitakarai, or naming ceremony, Ava-guarani sung a primary song throughout. And after that event, after that ritual ended, Pedro co-opted this song and started leading performers in it for the next several years. And that was obviously an instance of him putting himself, by playing the song, up there and associating himself with this particular great-grandfather shaman. And again, this is comparable to soloists in jazz, quoting the great masters, and in their attempts to quote these masters, they're also trying to come up with new things and be inspired, and this is a process of trying to find their own authentic true voice, which is arguably something that shamans are trying to do in a similar way. Now, besides just these sort of spiritual tributes to his mentors, Pedro also included improvisations in terms of the way he used his rattle. So he would play, most of the time, Pedro played with a duple meter, except for when I saw Pedro. And all the 14 other shamans I watched, none of them ever used anything but duple meter, so it was pretty much just straight up and down. But Pedro incorporated these elements of triple meter and odd groupings with his rattle, and sometimes he would start a roll in the middle of a line, and it would throw other people off. So this made him seem, he was really somewhat virtuosic with his rattle. I know it might not seem like you could be with the rattle, but trust me, you can. And other people couldn't really learn his parts. It was impressive to them. It made them mess up and not know where the beat was going to fall, so that made him seem like he had this other kind of authority. And in fact, when I mastered his entire repertoire and I would play along with him, he freaked out about it a little bit. He didn't say anything to me, but he started changing things up to mess me up. And so all of this was really welcomed by the folks who were watching him play. Wherever we went, there was always a great amount of excitement when Pedro would lead the music. His wife had a really beautiful voice as well, and them together, they were amazing, and people really enjoyed their performances. Pedro also had the support of the widow of the great-grandfather shaman who had died right before I got back, which is his mother's sister, so that also helped shore up his authority further. So through these highly skilled musical innovations, and he did innovate in other ways as well, but I'm not going to get into them here. If you're interested, the book hopefully will be coming out in a couple years. And then by quoting these great shamans, Pedro was signaling his primary charisma. His virtuosic instrumental and vocal performances would fascinate his supporters, and it would also make it difficult for his rivals to try to master what he was doing. So his charismatic musical prowess and then his improvisations directly expressed the knowledge that he gained from his communication with the world of the spirits, which signaled his primary charisma and was serving as proof of that primary charisma and ongoing by the people continuing to either accept it or reject it. Now, this all served to establish his position as a rising Tamoy or grandfather, as evidenced by the fact that all sorts of people were joining him in participants. So coming back to these tensions that I started out with between natural and common leaders, so again, natural leaders are the shamans, common leaders are elected officials, bureaucratic leaders. Now, whenever I was about 3 weeks in, I mentioned this briefly, to my first long-term field work when I got back there, and I had spent the first 3 weeks or so of this time exclusively with Pedro and his brother-in-law and some other shamans in the forest, usually learning all these things that they were teaching me, and I was at their mercy. I was barely able to communicate, so I did what they told me to for the most part. Something really strange happened when there was this performance in what we might call the centro, that's what they locally call it, of the community, where most of the houses are clustered. There was a great house there, which is where these rituals are held, and it's just a long house where the shaman typically lives, but it's owned by the community. During this performance led by 5 different shamans, the cacique or chief got up and interrupted everybody and said, you know, this guy's not learning anything, we need to kick him out of the community. And so it was really unpleasant for me, but people just basically dismissed him. The other shamans kept going, and I was really uncomfortable, but, you know, whatever, we kept going. So the next morning, Pedro had us leave to go to this other community, Ava-guarani. This is a picture from that night. You notice that the structure with the canoe type structure with the beverage in it is really close to the house there, which is kind of interesting. Not normal for most of the places. But the next morning, Pedro asked me if I wanted to go to Ava-guarani, and he took me off to this other community, and I had no idea why he was taking me at the time, but I clearly understand now that he was acting much like a shaman acts whenever he enlists the aid of his tutelary spirits in the spirit world to try to help cure somebody. So he was feeling that I was threatened, or that this cacique was threatening his attempts at authority, and he was taking me away to this other community where he could introduce me to this great-grandfather shaman, Ava-guarani, and also kind of keep me to himself, if you will, control me, like he might try to control one of these spirits that he's trying to use to help. So we made it to this other community the next evening, and just before sun was setting, we got to meet this great-grandfather shaman, and then slightly thereafter, the ritual began. The first guy that got up and performed was an elderly gentleman. He had a lot of missing teeth. The only people that got up to help in his performance were his wife and one of his small grandchildren, and you couldn't understand him very well. He had a speech impediment. He was very old. When you're missing a lot of teeth, you can't understand him anyways so easily, especially if it's a foreign language and you're learning it. But after his performance was done, people generally spectated. Nobody else joined in. They just hung out on the perimeter. But after he was done, Pedro went up, and there was this great excitement that just spread through the crowd, and all these people who had been just sort of goofing off, from a shaman's perspective at least, they suddenly are excited, they're into it. There's all these women joining and supporting him, and during his performance, you could just feel the level of excitement rise in intensity. It was almost like being at a rock concert, and somebody really famous was on the stage. So then, as the performance was going along, something even more impressive happened for Pedro, and that was this great-grandfather shaman came to sit at his feet to be healed, and this was obviously a big endorsement on his behalf of Pedro and his primary charisma and his route to becoming a Tamoy, or grandfather shaman. And in the process, Pedro asked the wife and children of Ava-guarani various questions about his illness. The relatives typically sit around you when you're being healed by a shaman, and they're part of the healing process. So Pedro's wife and women sat around, also singing and playing their instruments as he performed his healing. So the music continued, men continued playing the rattles, and occasionally Pedro would drop out and simply rely on the support of the other performers and the patient and his family, while he took the following routinized actions. First of all, he blew tobacco smoke all over the patient in order to purify the scene, which is really common in Native American cultures in general, but especially in South American ones specifically. He blew on the palms of his hands to warm them up, and then he rubbed them together and dusted them off. Action I saw repeatedly in these kinds of rituals. And then he also moved his open hands over the body of the patient, starting at the top of his head. And sometimes he would actually touch the patient, and at other times he would simply hover his hands over them, but he worked his way, generally speaking, down over him. And these activities would repeat themselves in these patterns that I've just described. And eventually, Pedro suddenly started sucking on the back of Ava-guarani's neck for a while, and everyone drew really near to see what was going on. A man moved a candle from the altar to illuminate the scene, because as you can see, these things happen in darkness, typically speaking, so there's not a lot of light. So then Pedro's body became limp, and he was physically supported by the adult sons of Ava-guarani. His eyelids started fluttering, closed, his head lolled about on his shoulders, and while this was going on, the music intensity just increased, even though he wasn't playing or singing, and reached a crescendo. Pedro dramatically displayed the absence of his soul, which was on a flight to the spirit world to locate the sick soul of Ava-guarani through his torpidity, which is a typical cross-cultural shamanic signifier of soul flight. And after a lot of murmuring by the various folks who were gathered around, the motion of Pedro's head became to be a little bit stronger and eventually opened his eyes. As his soul started to re-enter his body, Pedro dramatically raised his hand that held the ailments he had sucked out of Ava-guarani's body, and the onlookers crowded around so that they could see, with the man holding the candle, holding it in, and everybody finally could look and see it took the form physically of a wriggling insect. So it's a live insect he'd sucked out of this great-grandfather shaman. Another shaman took the illness away quickly, put it in a bottle, and blew smoke over it and hung it on the altar so that the illness couldn't get out and hurt anyone else in the community. And afterwards, Pedro talked to people and told them what he had found and what was wrong with the guy. And he consulted Ava-guarani's family to ask them if they knew where to find particular medicinal plants. They were to gather them for him the next day so that he could combine them to make medicine for him in a healing drink. Now, unfortunately, this particular cure didn't heal Ava-guarani physically speaking, so he still continued to have physical problems. But what's important in this case is not so much whether the healing session is effective only physically, but also that Ava-guarani and his family had affirmed the primary charisma of Pedro through their support of him and participating in the ritual. Not only that, but simply Ava-guarani asking Pedro to perform this ritual for him was really significant. He was the most powerful living shaman in the vicinity, in case that wasn't clear about that. Also, this exciting performance led to the community having this well-remembered period of collective effervescence that lasted and kept people kind of excited. And at the same time, one can't really give enough credit to the fact that even though Ava-guarani wasn't physically healed, he might have arguably considered himself to be spiritually healed. He'd probably been through a similar process when he was young, and so he's happy that he's passing these traditions on at some level to this younger shaman and endorsing him, because the common complaint of the elderly there, just like everywhere, is that the young people really don't know what they're doing, and they're getting it wrong, or the traditions remain lost. Okay. So he established these relationships with these folks in this community, but also in several other communities, and he was methodically in the process making himself a very well-respected natural leader and showing repeatedly that he had the necessary primary charisma and improvisational ability in order to rise as a natural leader. Again, as I mentioned previously, Pedro and a lot of community members were unhappy about the fact that the caciques in the community were not really doing what they needed to do. They were playing favorites, they were having cronies, giving their money and help to some people and not others. There was really a lot of dissatisfaction with this cacique at the time. And so Pedro decided that he was going to try to work on behalf of his community in the way that common leaders would do. Now, the way this worked out was Pedro formed a bureaucratic committee, and in this, he enlisted the aid of all these really important natural leaders in the community. So here he's talking to another shaman who's much older than him, and he's trying to talk to him. He's got these documents in his lap of this committee that he's filing, so he was literate. He could speak Spanish somewhat and write Spanish somewhat. So writing is obviously connected with the bureaucratic leaders because their position is totally about literacy and interactions with the state through documents, edicts, contracts, etc. But Pedro is taking the forest knowledge that he has and transposing it to the common realm to try to form this committee. So here's the document that he created and formed and filed with the district and locally in Ava-guarani. And I don't know if you can see it from there, but he put himself as president of this committee. And then his brother-in-law, who's also a shaman, is vice president. These are older shamans within the community, and this one as well. And then this is the widow of the dead great-grandfather shaman. So all the most powerful individuals on the natural leadership side of the community have supported Pedro in this. They were doing all this not completely secretly, but somewhat surreptitiously, trying not to let the common leaders know what was going on because they didn't really want to be challenged by it. But nevertheless, they were challenged by it. Pedro was successful in filing this. So by enlisting the aid of all these respected shamans and the widow of the dead shaman, he was following the pattern that you must if you want to be a successful natural leader. He was not acting singly. He was collaborating with other people, and that was in contrast to this cacique who was just making decisions that were selfish or conceived as selfish by some people within the community. So Pedro, although he was the youngest member of his committee, had established himself at the top of the hierarchy. His abilities allowed him to overcome his youth. Obviously, it's hard to represent yourself as a grandfather to people when you're 30 years younger than they are, for example. But he was well on his way on the road. I would ask older people like the cacique, why don't you come join Pedro in his dance, or why don't you dance with other people? And they would just say the same kind of thing, oh, we used to do this a lot, but these young guys don't know what they're doing, so we don't really respect them. And there's all this tension going on, and I was very much caught up in the middle of it all. So these other elders, obviously, such as the ones who participated in Pedro's committee, that supported him in his dances, that helped him with the Mita Carai that was held, they are saying, well, maybe he doesn't know everything yet, but we are giving him our stamp of authenticity, basically, by supporting him and by voting with him. And so this means that they were accepting the skilled improvisations that he was making, along with the collaborative improvisations of others, much like in a jazz combo. So Pedro, in his process to enlist Ava-guarani to come lead the naming ritual Mita Carai in 2005, was done without talking to the cacique. Also, traditionally, the cacique should have had something to do with that. And when I say traditionally, it's more recent, historically, traditionally. But they are the ones who should try to organize the logistics of making the event happen, sending out invitations to people in other communities. But he didn't do that. Instead, he went straight to the Tumoy-Guasu and the other community located some distance away. And finally, once this Tumoy-Guasu had come, and I went and helped transport the guy there and other people there, we get all these people together, the cacique is really bummed. He comes and he's trying to make the date be changed to show his authority. He comes and sits at the feet of the great-grandfather shaman and tells him, we want to move the date, and they basically tell him no. So he has to kind of slink off and accept defeat, and they go ahead and have the rite, and this cacique was gone. He wasn't even present for the crucial naming portion of the rite, which happens at the very end, which signified his defeat. So by successfully getting this ritual Mita Carai to happen and getting this powerful shaman to come and hold it, Pedro was greatly augmenting his reputation and power. At the end of the ceremony, he not only blessed the crops that would be there, sort of a first fruits kind of blessing for the new crops, but he also included these documents associated with the committee that he was forming, as well as you can kind of see here, if you know what they are, cassette recordings that I made of his performances and gave him. And he blessed these too, so he's taking these other outside elements, just like a shaman would, incorporating them into their tradition, and through the process of accepting these improvisations, people were voting for his rise to power. Now, unfortunately, they talked for the rest of my fieldwork in 2005 about going to the department capital to officially file this committee document, but because of their quotidian responsibilities and needing to participate in subsistence activities, family obligations, and healing activities also, they never were able to actually make it to the district. But by the time I returned the following year, they had achieved their goal because there was a new young cacique in the community, and the older cacique had been usurped. So contemporary Ava-guarani shamans continually find their traditional status as natural leaders as increasingly threatened by these bureaucratic common leaders, but in this case the reverse occurred. Despite Pedro's youth and his inexperience, he managed to both retain and also magnify his charismatic authority, partly because of his ability to improvise compelling variations upon the morphology of Gerald Kub, but also his musical improvisations in the process as well. The people voted for him. Again, I've said this repeatedly, and so he was finally able to challenge the authority of the local cacique and then ultimately force him out of office by creating this document, by holding Mita Carai. So men like Pedro are exemplars of Weber's primary charisma in the sense that they appear to have an innate ability to attract followers through their improvisations. At the same time, they're maintaining highly routinized patterns that are characteristic of both shamanic rituals and bureaucratic offices. So their improvisations are always variations upon a theme, and that's always the case with improvisation. The combination of improvisation and routinization gives them authority to improvise opposition to the bureaucratic power of the corrupt and selfish common leaders, and to present themselves as the guardians of valued tradition. Their improvisations might not always work out, which goes with the territory anytime you're improvising, whether in jazz or shamanism, but nevertheless, Ava-guarani shamans continue to thrive through a dialectical process of improvisation and routinization that enables them to collaboratively involve community members in their efforts to mediate between their own communities and those of outsiders, whether they're indigenous or the other. They're also able to maintain their religious rituals and through them continue to produce powerful shamans such as Pedro, who combines both respect for tradition with his impressive improvisatory skills. So the Ava-guarani data that I've talked about demonstrate that Weber's ideal types of primary charisma and routinized bureaucracy are long overdue for revision. The extensive ethnographic literature on shamanisms, along with comparative and historical reviews of specific cases, including the so-called classic cases in Siberian shamanism, suggests that there's never been an empirical example that corresponds to Weber's ideal type of primary charisma. Admittedly, ideal types are somewhat immune to such critiques, but nevertheless, by building upon previous approaches to cultural performances associated both with textual and performance theory, my data suggests that Weber's model might be significantly improved upon through an increased focus on the implicit improvisation that's inherent in his model of types of leadership. And as I've demonstrated in this paper, a performance approach employing the metaphor of group improvisation associated with small jazz combos will hone our analyses of shamanisms, whether in contemporary Eastern Paraguay or located elsewhere in time and space.
I want to know if there are some questions for Eric.
I just have one. It sounds like the process of becoming like a shaman is highly political. Is there a lot of rivalry between the shamans? I know you spoke about rivalry between caciques and shamans, but what about within the shamans themselves?
There definitely is some rivalry, but it wouldn't be necessarily acknowledged. But you can observe it. So they act like they're buddies and helping each other out because they need to do that to embody the kind of behavior a shaman should, and which is to lead a peaceful life and to be a good example for community members, but nevertheless at the same time they're definitely trying to outdo each other in certain ways and trying to, be the one that's going to rise up to be a grandfather or grandmother shaman. I wouldn't say that I saw any political jockeying so much with the female shamans I worked with, but they don't ever, even though they can become a person who can see the names, I was told I never witnessed it. But that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. I just haven't seen it myself.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about knowledge maintenance, maybe, just with everything that's going on in the rapid decline of knowledge systems.
In a particular sense?
It would seem, looking at it, that their knowledge would be endangered, but it sounds like it's very strong, especially with the literacy going on.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wonder if you feel like it's endangered or threatened by everything that's going on around them, or if it seems really strong and like you have a system to maintain it.
It seems like both, really, and that's the thing. I mean, on the one hand, there's plenty of time when it seems kind of depressing, and especially deforestation is a really depressing thing to deal with. Especially, I didn't mention it, but shamans cry about this regularly in their performances. It's part of one of the ways they would exhibit their primary charisma, and they complain constantly about the forest disappearing, the animals disappearing, the insects that make honey, for example, disappearing with the big trees too. But yet at the same time, we do have these young guys who are rising up, and they have obviously learned from the older people. And then living with Pedro and his family and watching his young boys, at the time he had one boy that was 3, and he obviously would play at being a shaman and dance in front of the altar with his rattle, and you could tell that he was picking all this up. And so eventually it's going to continue, probably. Is it going to stay the same? Probably not. It's going to change over time. But it's really interesting because the stuff that you read about that was described around 1900, and then even the stuff from the Jesuits from 500 years ago, it's pretty much the same.
Yeah.
The stuff is the same. The stories they tell when they tell their creation stories, same stories, almost word for word is the stuff, and they're not reading it. So it's hard to really answer that. I mean, with the forest disappearing, I mean, eventually it will be tough to maintain that tradition. Because that's one of the critiques by the older people of, he can't know this, he hasn't spent enough time in the forest, he's not getting this information. And then, of course, a lot of the young folks are interested in becoming modernized, and they want, some of it was his wife's kids, I think, who did it, but they drew pictures of helicopters with military guys hanging out shooting at people, and then when a truck would drive by with big logs, taking them away, Pedro's son would say, my thing, and meaning I want a truck, too. So it's hard to say. I mean, you would think that this stuff would have changed dramatically already, but yeah, it's extremely resilient. And I would say that part of that's because of the improvisation that's inherent in shamanism, because it allows for keeping stuff and then incorporating new things.
Thank you.
Speaking of multiple shaman,
Yes.
quite a few, in what size population, and what's, how does someone identify themselves, take on the role of a shaman, and is it profitable? Is it a valuable place in society to be, and that sort of thing? My model is that one tribe has one shaman, but you're talking about many.
Well, there's nearly 17,000 individuals according to the census, and of course the census is not going to be entirely accurate, so there are quite a few shamans, and not every community has a shaman, and so there are some communities that have accepted strong missionary presences, and in those communities they may have shamans, but they don't typically have a lot of followers. And if they do still perform, they may do some healing, but they're not having these big Jaraku kind of ceremonies, generally speaking. So they'll often go to other communities where they can participate in these things. And as far as how you become one, I mean, you're called by the Spirit, but people have to recognize you as being called. So I watched this happen with one young guy, and he was actually a mestizo, so he was half indigenous, half European. He hadn't grown up in an indigenous community. He came to be an apprentice to Pedro and kind of a servant to him simultaneously. So Pedro got his labor kind of in return for it. But he was not successful at all when he tried to become a shaman. I mean, people made fun of him. He didn't have a wife, so that was a serious impediment too, because he didn't have her to support him. But they also made fun of his singing. His singing wasn't so good, so he just wasn't believable to them for a variety of reasons. And other people, as far as becoming powerful, it's again the kind of relationship you have with your spouse, and if that's a good relationship and you have lots of kids, that's going to give you a lot of actual grandchildren, potentially, children, grandchildren to support you. And then those relationships are going to spread further out. So there are a lot of different factors involved in whether or not you can rise up in the ranks. And it takes time. I mean, it's not something you're necessarily going to, unless you're just an incredible healer right away, right from the beginning, then I don't think it would be a fast process. It just takes a long time. Did I answer
Yes,
most
yeah.
of what you... Okay.
No, of course, you're talking about charisma. Charisma is so important as far as the shamans are concerned. Do you think charisma can be inherited? Like in the United States, your great-grandfather had a lot of charisma that had an impact in terms of him becoming a very important shaman and throwing his weight around in a sense, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the way they talk about it is that it's a direct connection with God, but then of course, if you already have that family connection and arguably you grow up in that environment and it's going on, you're going to learn things anyways, and then there are politics about certain lineages being more powerful with the community versus others. And also here, really important is who you marry. So the male shamans who tend to become powerful in the Ava-guarani, this primary community, they often are married to women of the Gonzalez family. And so that by itself is just like that female kin group is really important. If one of those women will marry you and support you, there's a good chance you're going to end up, if you want to be a shaman, not all of them want to be. Right, but there's definitely that element, and there's also the element of apprenticeship. Even though they wouldn't really acknowledge it unless you push them. And I finally said, "So you studied with this shaman?" Well, yeah, I did, but really, he wouldn't tell you that straight up.
Oh yes, so you were saying that they need a lot of support from their family, like women. specifically? What if it's a women shaman that's trying to become a shaman?
The women,
Who do they get support from? Like their husbands, I guess? Or
yeah,
other women?
I only knew 3 female shamans, and I only knew one of them well. And so I can only really comment about her. And she was an interesting character because she was the sister of this dead great-grandfather shaman also. And their father had been a great shaman too. She kind of did whatever she wanted. And she never really stayed in one place very long. So that made it hard to have access to her. And usually when she would come back, it would always be more like, we couldn't get past the niceties and everything because she was staying on. But she didn't have a good relationship with her husband. She would leave him regularly because marriage and divorce are just a matter of who you sleep with. That's pretty much it. There's no ceremony, ritual for marriage or anything like that. And he was a little bit of a drunk, so she would leave him and get upset with him regularly. But it didn't seem to affect her being sought out as a healer. But I was told she could confer names and see the names and souls, but I never witnessed it, and she didn't even come to the naming ritual. So it's hard to really answer that question. I wish I had more data on female shamans.
So she had some privilege, basically.
She definitely had some privilege, but at the same time, she hadn't kind of risen all the way up to where these other individuals had. And the other 2 female shamans I only saw in one instance in each case, and I can't really comment much on it. I mean, it was interesting to watch the ritual, especially the woman who led with the female instrument, the bamboo stomping tube, rather than the rattle, because she led people in the dance, but while playing this rattle, this bamboo stomping tube all over the place. So it was different, and I assume she had, some power here too, because a lot of people joined in support of her ritual. The other woman I saw was just starting out, and she was from a marginal family too, so she didn't have any power that I could see. Her husband wasn't there. She had one, and she was the daughter of a shaman. So, future research would be really nice to find more information on female shaman.
Thank you.
What about this tension in between the common and the natural shaman? Is it has always been there, or is it more common now?
Well, it wouldn't have always been there in the sense that the common offices didn't even exist until the Jesuits came along. So the Jesuits, whenever they
Yeah, but the Jesuits, we're talking about 600 years ago.
Yeah.
So that's a long time too.
Yeah. So before that, they would have just had shamans, and then they would have had war chiefs essentially. But they would have only had a chief in times of war, and otherwise, you really, it would be the shaman who was the leaders in the peaceful times. So I imagine there was probably always tension between various actors who were competing for position in society, just like you see in most places. But of course, we don't know what happened before the Europeans arrived. And then mainly with the Jesuit missions, what you have instead is the shamans rejecting the leadership of the Jesuits. And when they had accepted it, they would usually fight back and go through and unbaptize people and do rituals to take away what the missionaries had done to them. So ever since then, I'm sure there have been tensions between the shamans and the common leaders. But I think it's increasing now, just because of what's happening in society. I mean, Paraguay is one of the most corrupt countries on the planet, and it's really bad. And so the deforestation and all this is going to happen. I mean, the land's being sold and stolen right underneath of everybody, and not just indigenous people, also peasants who are mestizos. And meanwhile, only a very small percentage of the population owns 90% of the land in the country. And so a lot of these people are called sin tierras, so they don't have land, they don't have title, and so you have lots of protests going on, lots of conflict. There's a really big conflict between the police and peasants last year, while about 15 people total died in it, and that's still really affecting things locally. I haven't been back yet, but things are pretty heated up in general right now. And with the recent election of the new president, Cartes of Paraguay, whose son, by the way, just went to jail in Miami over the weekend for battery, which didn't make it into the American news. He is a former official criminal. He was pursued for drug activities and bad business dealings. But he's a major soy businessman, and so he's involved. And all of this just means that the shamans who are trying to fight, and I asked Pedro, why are you doing this? Why are you being a shaman? He's educated, he can do whatever he wants. And of course, as these kinds of questions go, you don't really get an answer that makes this is what I do, this is what I was called to do, and that's what I'm trying to do. So he would talk about it as if God chose me to do this, and this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to fight for my people. And unfortunately, there are no easy answers. It's just complicated and messy.
Can you talk a little bit more about how you navigated being in the middle of this conflict between the two kinds of leaders in the community? Maybe how that affected your research, and just some like reflections on, did you feel like you were aggravating like problems in the community, or just like you were in the middle of a pre-existing tension?
I very much felt like I was just in the middle of a pre-existing tension. I wasn't the first anthropologist to work there. There was one before me, one American anthropologist who'd worked there. They'd had missionaries come and they'd expelled them too over the years, so they had these different things going on. But this cacique really wanted me to stay with him when I arrived, even though I was telling him I'm here to stay with the shaman I stayed with when I was here 4 years ago. And I hadn't even met the cacique. I had no idea who he was. And he didn't speak any Spanish hardly at all, so I was just learning Guarani, so I didn't. And meanwhile, this other shaman I wanted to stay with spoke some Spanish, and so it made more sense for me to live with him. So right away, I just found myself there, and him tearing me and trying to control me and make me be with him. And meanwhile, I'm telling him I'm here to study shamans. These are the shamans. I'm going to go study them and go live with them, and that was it. So it was really uncomfortable. He kept trying to force me to come be with him, and he would come around and kind of threaten me, or he would speak to me in Guarani, and then in the esoteric Guarani that only older people generally know. Once I'd been there a while, just to prove that these young guys don't know what they're doing, you should come learn from me. I'm the one who knows the real Ava-guarani culture, and this other anthropologist had lived with him previously, so I think he kind of felt like he had some authority over him, as well as the deceased shaman, the other anthropologist that lived with him previously too. So I just was caught up in this thing that was already going on. There was a feud between the deceased great-grandfather shaman's family and Ricardo Santa Cruz's family that had been ongoing long before I arrived, including murder of a pregnant woman on Ricardo Santa Cruz's side, his daughter. She was very pregnant, very far along the way. So that didn't have anything to do with me, but I just was sort of sucked into it. And then right away, Pedro was very opportunistic. He tried to control me, and I could go on and on about it. In the beginning, I had helped to wash my hands or to bathe. It was just for the first month, I would say, he controlled almost my every single move. There wasn't much I could do. I barely spoke the language. I didn't really know what his motivations were all the time.
Is there anything that they're doing to kind of like preserve their life? Because if they keep going with deforestation, like how are they gonna be around, let's say 20 years from now?
Well, sadly, especially on the Brazilian side, there's a lot of suicide, especially in the younger generations. And one community on the Brazilian side has been getting the shaft so badly that they've been planning a mass suicide and protest to kill all of them, the whole community, women, men, children, are planning to kill themselves collectively. And as far as I know, this hasn't actually happened yet, but they're threatening because their rights are so exploited. On the Brazilian side, there's really no forest left in this area, and they're picked off, they're murdered. One of my friends was murdered in August. This shaman, you actually saw a picture of him on the Paraguayan side in the community. So it's tough, it's insecure, and it's changing for everyone. If the scientists are right about the projections for climate change, in 10 years, that area is not going to be very livable for any life at all. So it doesn't look good. It's very depressing. If I would have thought about that. Most people, when they hear about what I do, they're, you had to worry about snakes or bugs or whatever. It's like, really, that's not that big of a deal. The hard part is just the weight of watching this and caring about these people and this environment, and there's nothing I can really do.
Did you record the music, and how do you view those recordings?
You want to see some now?
I'd love
Do we
to.
have time?
Show a little bit.
It looks like it's pretty something. If I was really sophisticated, I would have this in my PowerPoint presentation. I'm not there yet. This is in a DVD drive. Oh wait, no, I'm sorry. There you go. Yeah, I have hours and hours and hours of video and audio recordings and stuff. And the performances don't really lend themselves to playing for people in the sense that they take a really long time. They're not sort of Western. And they're also all recorded with night shot, so. This is the great grandfather shaman. He's standing with the men, and the women are facing him.
And is Pedro playing the rattle?
No, this one, oh, he may be in the group, but the man leading it is Ava-guarani, the great grandfather shaman. And of course, some of the younger shamans' dances will be a lot faster and more acrobatic or whatever than some of the older guys. But mostly the dance is fairly simple, mainly going in a counterclockwise pattern. Sometimes they go back and forth. But some of the younger shamans, I would see them do a really interesting kind of combat type of dance in a figure-8 pattern while the shaman basically chasing the other guy around. And it very much looks like a combat, even though they don't actually touch each other ever. That's why he's leading them out around the dancing ground. Unfortunately, it looks ghostly because it's a night shot. Otherwise, you wouldn't see anything except for when it was right by the light. And I'm not going to bring spotlights into the area. I mean, there wasn't electricity here anyway, so I would have had to have a really sophisticated setup. So you get the idea. I mean, these things are pretty much like that. It just goes on, and they're different songs. You might call them songs.
Are the leaders the ones that are usually educated, the only ones? In the shamans?
No, most of the time the shamans aren't necessarily educated, especially the older ones. I mean, they may know some Spanish or Portuguese, but they're not usually necessarily literate. It's the younger folks who have gone to school, at least for a few years. Okay. Like Pedro, he's still fairly young, and he had gone to school. But to be a cacique, you really kind of, especially now, you really need to be able to deal with documents with the courts and the government.
Thank you.
You were mentioning a cacique that only spoke Guarani. So I couldn't be a cacique who didn't speak Spanish. Don't get a language of authority and well, it would be very important for us to know Spanish also.
It's useful, but in Paraguay, uniquely, at least in the Western Hemisphere, an indigenous language is actually an official language of the state, so everything legal goes through Spanish and Guarani. But more important is, if you really want to, like, the particular cacique, he would have been better off if he knew some Portuguese, because he could interact with the people close by.
Yeah.
But that was not so much in the performance of his duties as cacique, but more in terms of trying to attract people for trade and relationships and that kind of stuff, because he couldn't communicate with them. But everybody speaks Guarani in Paraguay, except for maybe, newcomers. Out the countryside, not many people speak Spanish, or very little.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.